This is footage of Amsterdam in wartime, an empty, desolate city. Holland is occupied by Germany. The majority of Jewish inhabitants have been deported to concentration camps. A few have managed to hide from the Nazis in cellars and attics, harbored by friends and strangers. On the Prinsengracht, the staff of the wholesaler Opekta had hidden 8 Jews in an annex. One of them was Anne Frank. Her diary would become world famous. Miep Gies was one of 4 staff members who helped Anne Frank. In the early summer of 1942, Otto Frank, the manager of Opekta, called her into his office on the lower floor of the annex.
Ja.
Well, he rang me and said, "Miep, would you come in a moment, please?" I came in and he asked me to sit down. "I have something very important to tell you," he said. "A secret, really.
Een soort geheim eigenlijk.
We plan on hiding ourselves here, in this house."
Onder te duiken, in dit huis.
Are you prepared to help us?
Om ons daarbij
with provisions and so forth?
met levensmiddelen te verzorgen, enzovoort.
I said, yes, of course. I thought that it went without saying.
The Frank family came from Frankfurt am Main in Germany. Otto Frank and Edith Hollander were married in 1925. Margot was their firstborn, followed in 1929 by Anne.
Deutschland nicht geschenkt erhielten, sondern selbst nicht schaffen muss.
When Hitler and the Nazis came to power in 1933, they began to terrorize Jews openly. Alarmed by this race hatred, the Franks resolved to leave Germany and settle in Holland with their 2 daughters. In one of Amsterdam's new suburbs, they found an apartment on the Merwedeplein. Otto Frank became manager of the wholesaler Opekta in the city center.
I was hired in 1933. I thought I would start out in the front office, but that didn't happen.
Maar dat was niet zo.
On my first day, Mr. Frank took me to the kitchen. He put fruit, sugar, and a recipe in front of me, plus the utensils with which to make it, and said, "Let's see you prepare this recipe."
Nu maar dit recept.
I worked a good month in the kitchen. I learned properly how things should be done. I learned what mistakes could occur and how to correct those mistakes.
En wat je eventueel fout kunt maken. En hoe je fouten weer goed kunt maken.
And then Mr. Frank said, "Take a desk in the front office. Start answering the phone. You're our public relations officer." Our product was popular with Dutch women who wanted to make jam in 10 minutes. They had to use a certain proportion of fruit and sugar, but often what they do was use much more fruit than sugar, and it would go wrong. Mr. Frank was a very refined man, a real gentleman.
Een zeer beschaafd iemand. Een heer, weet je wel, hè.
His wife came by the office once with Anne when she was 4. Anne was a bit shy, but she gave me a slight curtsy. She was very bright-eyed. I showed her around the office. I let her do some typing and have a look out the window. She loved every bit of it. She was a very lively child. That was our first meeting, quite brief. After a while, Mr. Frank invited me to his home for a meal. Naturally, it was quite an honor.
ben ik weer
I'm back in the house where
in
Otto
het
Frank
huis
lived.
waar Otto Frank gewoond heeft. En waar ik vaak geweest ben.
I was here
waar ik
often.
hele leuke herinneringen.
I have fond memories of this place.
Het grijpt me meer aan.
This
dan dat
affects
ik
me more than I'd expected.
weer in het huis te zijn.
Being back in the Frank family home where
Van de familie Frank,
I had been so
waar ik
often.
vaak geweest ben. Dit doet pijn, hè?
This hurts.
Dit is
This
onvoorstelbaar.
is unimaginable.
Je moet er even
I have to collect myself and regress in my memories to
Je
that
laat
time.
even je gedachten weer
It
teruggaan.
could have all turned out so differently if we'd
Naar die
managed to
tijd.
pull through.
Het had zo anders kunnen zijn. Als we het gered hadden.
We had every hope that we would.
Ze zijn hier heel gelukkig geweest.
They were very happy here.
Allemaal.
All of them.
Anne was
Anne bristled with life. She was inquisitive. She had eyes that sparkled. By contrast, Margot was quiet and deferential.
Mevrouw Frank.
Mrs. Frank was friendly, quiet, and a bit reserved.
Een beetje teruggetrokken. En ja, meneer Frank.
When we were here,
als wij hier
Mr.
waren,
Frank always
met die
initiated
woorden
conversation.
aan tafel, die sprak
He
met
talked to
ons.
us.
Ik was natuurlijk
I was
zeer
quite delighted to be invited by the boss.
werd uitgenodigd door de baas.
But Mr.
Maar
Frank had a
meneer
certain
Frank had daar
intent
toch
in
een
doing
bedoeling
that.
mee. Want, kijk eens...
See, the immigrants who came here tended to be restricted to their own groups.
Zelf weer aangewezen. Die hadden geen vrienden.
They had no friends
Maar
here.
meneer Frank
But
kon
Mr.
met de
Frank kept
Hollandse
company
vrienden
with two
aankomen.
Dutch
En
friends,
dat waren wij.
namely us.
En omdat ik zo'n interesse
Because
had
I
in
was
de
interested in
politiek en de
politics and
cultuur,
had
altijd met
political
hem
discussions
sprak
with him in the office, he included us amongst his acquaintance
Ook
and
onze
amongst his
vrienden.
friends,
En dat vond ik
albeit
wel aan.
later.
Toen kwamen we op de zaterdag.
We had come around on the Saturday afternoon.
En daar kwam meneer Van Pels.
Mr.
met
Van
zijn
Pels
vrouw,
was there with his wife,
Dr. Pfeffer.
and Dr. Pfeffer with his
Schone
lovely
vrouw.
wife,
En er werd de hele
and we
toestand
discussed the issues
besproken.
of the day.
De toestand over de oorlog.
We discussed the war and
hoe dat
debated
zou gaan,
this
hoe
and
dat zou
that.
gaan. Maar kijk eens,
But
die mensen
people
die
living
hier waren,
here
die voelden zich
thought they'd be
safe.
safe.
Het was Holland.
This was Holland.
En we dachten allemaal...
We thought we'd just
zullen we
stay
weer
out of it,
blijven.
like in
Net
World
als
War I.
1418. Niemand dacht eraan
No
dat
one
wij
imagined
ook
that we
eens
ever become the
slachtoffer
victims
zouden worden
of the
van
Nazis.
de nazi's. Toen kwam de
Then
10e
came the
mei.
10th of May.
Dat was een schok voor ons allemaal.
That shocked us all.
We werden opgeschrikt.
We were alarmed by the aircraft,
We wachten af.
but we waited and heard,
Toen hoorden we dat Rotterdam...
eventually, that Rotterdam had been
Een paar
bombed.
dagen. Nou, toen wisten we wel...
We knew clearly what that would mean.
betekende. Als Nederlander...
A good Dutchman didn't watch the occupation force roll in.
Wij zijn er niet naartoe gegaan.
We didn't go.
Wij bleven.
We stayed at our jobs.
De angst...
Eventually, our fear subsided a bit because the Germans were very pragmatic.
bekeken
They
hadden.
didn't upset things too much for the first 2 years.
De eerste 2 jaren deden
Didn't
niet veel,
interfere.
Dus dan kwam je weer bij.
That way, you could adapt too much for the first 2 years.
De eerste 2 jaren deden
Didn't
niet veel,
interfere.
Dus dan kwam je weer bij.
That way, you
Dat
could
nou,
adapt
valt
and think,
wel mee.
well,
Hoewel
it's
je
not
toch
so
niet
bad.
wendig dacht, verdikken.
Although inwardly the thought remained, this is Holland. It belongs to us. Initially, they didn't interfere greatly with the Jews, but by degrees, prohibitions were introduced. Jews were not permitted on the trams.
Jews must wear a yellow star. Jews must relinquish their bicycles. Jews must go to Jewish schools, and many more restrictions. As we walked across our square a few days ago, Father talked about going into hiding. We don't want to be seized, he said, so we'll steal away and not wait until they come for us.
On Sunday evening, the doorbell rang, and who should be there but Mr. Van Pels? He entered, and looking grim, he said, Margot's been conscripted into labor. She has to report tomorrow. The decision had been made to go into hiding, and I was instructed then to go the next morning and collect Margot on my bike and lead her as the first one into hiding. We arrived here. I opened the entry door and took in the bicycles. We went upstairs. When she could not go on, I prodded her forward because I felt her dismay. Where am I? What's happening? I thought, she's going to faint. Get her inside. I opened the door quickly and I jostled her inside. It all seemed a bit callous, really, like I was saying, now you're on your own. I ran back downstairs and opened the main door so that the staff could get in.
At 7:30 in the morning, we closed our front door behind us. People early on their way to work looked at us with pity. The gaudy yellow star spoke for itself. We only wanted to get away and to arrive safely, nothing else. When we were in the street, Father and Mother told me about the plan. The hiding place would be in the building where Father had his office. When we arrived at the Prinsengracht, Margot was already waiting for us.
Mr. Frank glanced round the corner, saw me, and nodded to me. It was a signal that Anne, her mother, and he had arrived safely. Therefore, I shouldn't worry. This was the bedroom of the Frank family. There was a bed here and one there. There was a table in front of the window, and in the corner, a stove.
Mother and Margot were too tired and wretched to move a muscle. Our rooms were so full of rubbish that it was beyond description. Father and I, the two cleaners in the family, worked the whole day until we sank into clean beds at night. If you go up the stairs and open the door, you'll be amazed to find such a big, bright room in an old canal house. This serves as the kitchen, common room, and the Van Pels bedroom. The Van Pels family arrived on July 13th. To our great amusement, Mrs. Van Pels had a large chamber pot in her hat box. "I just don't feel at home without my potty," she declared. Mr. Van Pels had no potty, but rather a folding tea table under his arm. From the day they arrived, we all had meals amicably together, and after 3 days, it was just like we were one big family.
Van het volk van Nederland houdt ze goed. Het kleine Holland weert zich dapper als een reus. Het is oranje, blijft oranje, is de leus. Voor u, voor mij en voor de watergeus.
Mr. Frank had brought a box full of pictures, which Anne had clipped from magazines at home. Here's one of them. This, for example, is Heinz Rühmann. He was one of the stars of our day. Greta Garbo. I don't recall that one. Lily Baumeister. She was also a screen actress. Anne cut this one out as well. Oh, how she loved these pictures. She had other pictures of people who interested her. Norma Shearer. She really loved her. Diana Durbin. And the royal family. She clipped whatever pictures she didn't have from here. The weekly review, Cinema and Theater. That's how she used to increase her collection. Those people all believed, logically enough, that they'd only be here temporarily. I always got the impression from each of them they thought it would be over soon. I think they counted on that. So they never indulged in amenities of any sort. In the other rooms, they didn't so much as hang a picture.
It's amazing how far people will go to help others at the risk of their own lives. Our helpers are a fine example of this. Mr. Kleiman, Mr. Kugler, Beppe Miep have really pulled us through.
Until August 21st, 1942, this was the entrance to the annex, an ordinary door. The step was still there. On that day, the staff downstairs, Mr. Kugler and Ellie's father, arrived at the shrewd idea of barricading it. And what could be better for that purpose than a bookcase set in front of? In this way, the entrance would be camouflaged. These windows were pasted with paper with a floral pattern, making it impossible to see outside. In the front, the windows were painted blue. This also obstructed any view.
I can't tell you how oppressive it is never to go outside. Naturally, we're not allowed to look out the windows. I'm afraid that we will be discovered and shot.
This is a shopping list for the butcher. We each had our specific tasks. Ellie was responsible for the baker and the milkman. My task was to bring in vegetables and meat. I found this in one of my coat pockets after the war. I was incredibly pleased to find it. This was my desk. Bep sat opposite me. This was my desk. Bep sat opposite me at a similar desk. Mr. Kleiman sat here alongside. We three formed a close-knit group. To the rear was another office belonging to Mr. Kugler. He would come by every now and then. During office hours, we didn't discuss our refugees much. Everything had to proceed as normal. Talking about them created a certain tension. It caused you to worry about them in the office, and that wouldn't do. It was vital that we appeared to the outside world, to people who came here, to be as nonchalant as possible. Mr. Frank had said, "Meep, find a greengrocer that's close by." So I used to go to a shop on the Lelystad. But in May of 1943, when I entered the shop lady told me that her husband had been seized. They had been hiding 2 Jews themselves. Mr. Frank insisted then that I not go there for the time being because it was too dangerous. I came away from the canal and went in the opposite direction towards the Rozengracht. Here I found a small cellar. Yeah, it looked quite different in those days. It was a plain cellar where the vegetables would be lying on the ground or on pallets. Also, vegetables were scarce then. That's a striking difference. I came in and encountered an old woman who was somewhat disabled. She was whining and moaning to herself. I listened to her, and what was she talking about but her kids? Her kids who had discarded her and who only came around when they needed money or vegetables or whatever. She prattled on like that, and I agreed with her at every turn. Meanwhile, I had an eye out for what I could get. That was quite important. Surprisingly, without any trouble whatsoever, she served me. You'd come up, and there was a level of tension as you entered the room. They waited anxiously for you in a row. They waited for whatever you might say. That made me feel dreadful. Only Anne would greet me and say, "Hello, Miep. Got any news?" Her mother always hated that. Anne was often criticized for her behavior. The children, the Franks' children, were raised in far too liberal an atmosphere. I knew that when I left, Mrs. Frank and Mrs. Van Pels would quarrel over it. But Anne couldn't help herself. It was just her way. She was spontaneous and said what was on her mind. That the others just waited until I spoke, I found truly dreadful, because I could feel their utter dependency on us, their helpers. The meekness with which they greeted me each morning was terrible. They would give me a list of what they needed, a shopping list and so forth. When that business was done, one of them would scamper up to me, Mrs. Van Pels, for example, and say, "Miep, I need this or that too." I just wrote it down and tried to get it.
Miep told us that they were rousting Jews from their homes again. Countless friends and acquaintances have gone to a terrible end. Any revelation from Miep concerning the fate of an acquaintance makes Mother or Mrs. Van Pels cry. So Miep now thinks it's best not to say anything at all.
Those were terrible events, and I related them all honestly. I recounted whatever happened in town. After a while, my husband Jan said, "Miep, please don't tell them everything. You have to remember that these people are incarcerated. They're not free to move. That's depressing enough as it is. At least dilute the truth slightly, just skim the surface." So, I did that. But that didn't get past Anne. She sensed there was more to be told. When I'd said what I had to say and I was poised to go, she would take me aside for a chat. She'd say, "Miep, tell me about this and that." She'd question me so extensively that I couldn't avoid it any longer, and I told her everything. That was Anne.
If it is this bad in Holland, what is it like in the distant reaches where they go? We assume that most of them are murdered. The English radio speaks of their being gassed. Perhaps that's the quickest way to die.
Of the persistent reports that some of these camps in Germany are in fact extermination camps with specially constructed gas.
The English radio has always told the truth. The fact is that in Poland and Russia, millions of peace-loving people are simply murdered or gassed.
Those events were discussed in the annex, what was known of them, what they'd heard. But speaking for myself, I could not believe that people would do such atrocious things. I simply could not believe it. I had no idea that Anne would write it all down. What do you imagine when you see a child with a diary? You wouldn't think she'd write such things. Dr. Pfeffer was my dentist and a close acquaintance of the Franks. The Pfeffer asked me incessantly if I could hide him. I said no. I went to Mr. Frank and told him that Pfeffer wanted to go into hiding. The next day, Mr. Frank said, "Miep, where 7 people eat, 8 can eat as well. Go tell Pfeffer you have a place for him." Naturally, he needed to sleep somewhere. It was arranged that Pfeffer would sleep here and Anne would settle over there. This was Anne's table, which she now had to share with Pfeffer.
Yesterday I asked Pfeffer quite politely if I might also use our table. What do you think the very learned Pfeffer replied? No. Just plain no.
Pfeffer wrote letters to his wife here, and he studied Spanish. Therefore, he sat for long periods of time at the table. Meanwhile, Anne was attempting to carry on with her diary.
One moment I thought I'm going to smack him in the face, and then the next, stay calm, he's not worth getting upset about.
This here is one of Pfeffer's letters to his wife. It's dated November 15th, 1942. My one dear love, I wish you a splendid good morning. I find it difficult to respond to you in a letter since I'm accustomed to discussing everything with you day to day. So his letter begins. It ends, concerning the cigarettes which I've saved for you for so long. I smoke but one a day. I conveyed her letters to him and his letters to her, but I never knew the contents of them, or that of the packages I delivered. This occurred regularly every 14 days. When I'd come by in the morning, he'd already be waiting for the letters that I'd bring. Naturally enough, he'd ask me, "How's my wife? What's she doing? What did she say?" So I'd stand there talking to him longer than was strictly necessary. And thereafter, I'd go up to collect my shopping list. Moreover, they were obliged to wait upstairs until I arrived. Once Mr. Frank asked, "Miep, could you please not talk to Pfeffer for so long? Anne doesn't appreciate the delay." That was the only time I got angry with Mr. Frank. I said, "Listen here, sir. You have your whole family here with you. He's here alone. I am the only link between him and his wife. Doesn't it make sense that he'd question me?" Then Mr. Frank said, "Yes, Miep, you're right."
The only bright spot in all this is that I can write down my thoughts and feelings. Otherwise, I'd suffocate in here.
We all had, as I'd mentioned, our appointed times to go upstairs. It was my task to come around in the morning. But I so pitied them not being able to move about during the day that I'd sometimes sneak upstairs during the afternoon. One day, I snuck upstairs and I entered the Franks' bedroom. This was it. Anne sat writing here. I entered the room, and as I was getting accustomed to the light, I saw her sitting here. I thought, "Oh gee, I'm disturbing her while she's writing in her diary." I felt awkward and wondered what to do. Should I retreat quietly or approach her? At the moment, she glanced up and fixed me with an expression that I never will forget. It wasn't the Anne that I knew, the friendly, charming child. She had an expression of pent-up fury. "Yes," she said, "I'm writing about you, too." I didn't know what to say. The only words I could manage were, "Well, that'll be something." Then I turned and darted back downstairs.
We live without knowing why, for what purpose. We live intent on being happy. Our lives are different, yet alike. As young as I am, I know what I want. I know that I am a person unto myself. Let me be myself, and I'll be content.
Mrs. Frank was a very quiet, refined woman. She was a very devout woman. This is one of her prayer books. She tried to influence Anne, but Anne wasn't too keen on it. Mrs. Frank also tended to be pessimistic. Miep, she used to say, "I won't make it. I can't go on. No good will come of this." She used to tell me all her fears and anxieties. Well, what could I say? I couldn't give her hope. I had none. Yet it helped that someone listened to her anxieties and fears.
Who besides me will ever read these letters? It's a wonder that I haven't discarded my ideals. I see us encircled by black clouds. I hear the imminent thunder of our doom.
It was quiet in the office. We were about our jobs. Suddenly I looked up. The door was open and a small man came in, pointing a revolver at me. He said to me, "Sit down. Don't even flinch." I went numb. And he left and closed the door as he went. Kleiman sat here, Pep sat there. Kleiman was the first to speak. Miep, he said, "It's over." We sat without knowing what to do. Suddenly, Bep got up and she began to wail and shake through her whole body. I stayed seated. I don't know why. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't comfort her. And Kleiman went to her. He said, "Here's my wallet. Go to the druggist on the Lelygracht. Don't give it to him. Simply display it to show that you know me. He's a friend of mine. Ring my wife and tell her what's happened here. And then beat it and don't ever come back." Ellie looked at me helplessly, wondering what to do. I said, "Get going, Ellie." She took off running and she didn't come back. That alerted us that there was no sentry at the door. A bit later, I heard Jan's footsteps. It was lunchtime. Before he could come in, I ran to the door with my sandwich, my ration book, my money, and my papers. I opened the door and said, "Jan, it's gone wrong here. Clear off." Off he went. There was simply no point in involving anyone else. The fewer people involved, the better. So, off he went. We sat there, Kleiman and I. He looked at me. And because it was still possible to leave, he said, "Miep, there's still time. You can go." I said, "No, I can't. I'm going with you." So we sat there. A little while later, the door to the inner office opened, and it stayed open. Then someone came and called Kleiman in. Behind the door, a man was speaking in German. It had a very familiar sound. He spoke with an accent. That much was clear. When Kleiman returned, the gravity of the situation became clear. At least how dire it was. He said, "Miep, see that you stay out of it. Salvage what you can here." He was taken away. I thought, yeah, that's easier said than done. He was taken away. I thought, yeah, that's easier said than done. Meanwhile, the small man with the revolver had returned. He sat down opposite me at Pep's desk and rang for an extra van. They hadn't expected to find so many people. He left the door open. In the hall, I heard the German issuing orders. Finally, I recognized the accent. He spoke with a Viennese accent. I was born in Vienna. I came here at the age of 11. I've completely assimilated. When I heard that, I thought I've got one chance. I'm going to take it. And I did take it. He marched in. Before he could utter a word, I stood erect. Germans are accustomed to that. I said, "You're from Vienna?" "Me too." I said it rather cheerfully. The man was shocked so utterly that he just stood there, staring. He could never have imagined that he would meet a fellow Austrian here. He closed the door and rounded on me. He was hunched. He was going to let me have it. He said, "Papers." I gave them to him, identity papers. He looked at them, thrashed them against my face, and started to swear. "Have you no shame helping Jewish scum? You're a traitor to your country. Your crime demands the highest penalty. I think you know what that is." I didn't answer. What's the point of speaking to someone like that? I stood at attention. He seethed with anger. He paced the length of the room, swearing at me, but I didn't respond. At a certain moment, he paused. He sized me up with a more mild gaze and said, "As far as I'm concerned, you can stay. But if you ever leave, we'll seize your husband." I made a blunder then, but it came out all right. I was so angry that I said, "You keep your hands off my husband. He's got nothing to do with this. It's my affair." He said, "Don't be so foolhardy. He's up to his neck in this." He said, "I'm leaving now, but I'll be back to check if you're still here." I thought, "You can be bloody sure I will. I'm staying come what may." The thing was, I understood what Kleiman had meant. "Me see that you stay out of it. Salvage what you can here." If one Christian remained in a house where the Jews had been, only the property of the Jews was removed. Christian property remained intact, so the business remained intact. The stocks and the equipment remained. Otherwise, 4 days later, everything would have been appropriated as the house was closed. The thought was, if she stays, the business can be saved. It was August of 1944. Anyone of any intelligence could see that the Germans were losing the war. I don't know what went on in the annex, since I was obliged to stay at my desk. He closed the door and departed. Later, I heard them all trudging down the stairs. In the interim, they were allowed to pack, and then they descended the stairs. I couldn't go to the window. I was compelled to stay here. I did so. We went upstairs then, to the Franks' bedroom. Bep and I saw lying on the ground the pages of Anne's diary. We saw scattered pages. That's Anne's diary. Gather it up, I said. Bep just stood there gawking. I said, "Pick it up. Pick it up. Take it." We preserved it as carefully as possible. We were stunned. We gathered it together and went downstairs. I said, "What now, Bep?" She said, "You're the oldest. You should keep it." I said, "Okay." I took it and put it in my desk. I locked up, or at least closed, the door. And that's where it remained until Mr. Frank returned. That winter was particularly cruel. North Holland had been cut off by the Germans. Still, one had to manage to find food. People would scrounge for food in any way they could.
Om een eten te kopen.
Liberation Day. We took newspapers and old rags to the Rijnstraat and set them alight. We danced and staggered around. We embraced complete strangers. Such was our joy at being liberated. We were hopeful then. Because of his work for the city, Jan was posted at the station. His job was to register those returning from the concentration camps. He asked everyone, "Do you have any news of Mr. Frank?" No, no, no. Then one evening, Jan came home and said, "I got good news for you, Miep. Otto's on his way here." We lived on the ground floor. We stared outside. He scarcely said it when Mr. Frank approached and rang the doorbell. I ran to the door. He came in. I said, "Where's Edith?" "Edith won't be coming back. I still have hope for the children." You can imagine how happy we were to have him back. I always sorted the post in the office and brought it to him. I sorted it and gave him what I had. He took it. Suddenly an icy silence descended, a silence which still speaks. I looked up. He'd gone bone white. He gave me this letter. Here, read it. I hereby declare that Anne Frank and Margot Frank perished in the camp Bergen-Belsen, where I worked as a nurse. Mrs. M. Brandes Brillers Slijper. I stood up then. And opened my desk drawer. I gathered up every volume of the diary and presented them to Mr. Frank with the words, "This is the legacy of your daughter, Anne." Time and again he would say to me, "Miep, come here. Look at what that child has written." That was troublesome for me. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't stand to read it. I was afraid. I don't know why. I said, "Sure, I'm coming." I was afraid. I don't know why. I said, "Sure, I'm coming." When the first edition was printed, he said, "Miep, you should read the book." I said, "Sure, I will." When the second edition was printed, Mr. Frank got angry, said, "Read it now. I want you to." I said, "Okay, I'll read it when I'm alone, so I can weep and wail as I please." I read through to the end. I have to admit, I was happy. It was like having them all back again. It wasn't the frightful task I'd imagined it to be. I was relieved, but more than that, I was happy. I could even hear their voices again.
As you've never endured a war, I'll tell you our wishes for when we emerge from hiding. Margot and Mr. Van Pels want to have a hot fall bath. Mrs. Van Pels wants to go and eat cream cakes. Feather only wants his Charlotte, and Mother her cup of coffee. Peter wants to go to the cinema. And I? For sheer joy, I wouldn't know where to begin.